a general, very quick round before we go to you, Professor Forastiere. The subheading of this symposium I thought was very interesting. It was how to improve air quality, and then the lines was research, evaluation, and social change. And just very quickly, which of those three topics, research, evaluation, societal change, on those three areas, which for you in your personal and professional life is the greatest challenge? The research, the evaluation of the research, or actually getting it into people's heads in society? Maybe we'll start with you, Professor Forastiere.
Yeah, we can. Okay, it seems to me that all the three should be going on at the same time, and it's very difficult which one should go first. Of course, research is something that should continue, and we know that the effects of air pollution are not limited to cardiovascular and respiratory organs. We now know much more, and it's the air pollution research is like the tobacco research. So at the beginning we thought it was only lung cancer, it was only COPD, but then we discovered that the cardiovascular system was involved, and then many more other organs. So research is important. Evaluation is important, especially evaluation of the efforts to reduce air pollution. And any programs that the politicians put into action, it's very important to have some evaluation built in. That's very difficult with politicians because they want to do stuff. But when they want to do stuff, it's a role for us as a public health officers and scientists to build in an evaluation of the action. And that's very important, because some actions comes with effects, some actions don't come with effects. And then the third one, it was very clear from WHO, stop burning any fossil fuels. That's very important, and this applies to, of course, energy, industry, and does apply also to transport. Mm-hmm. And that is a sort of community effort, and we should advocate for this.
Because you're leaving in 5 minutes, maybe I'll just stick with you, okay, and then I'll come to the rest of the panelists. You said all of the three are equally important, but what do you say to colleagues here? What is actually the role of the WHO and its data collection and its advisory role in actually creating clarity and creating priorities in the world on these issues?
Yeah, of course, WHO is an important body and has high reputation from the scientific point of view. And WHO has a relationship with different member states. So there is always an action that WHO could do with the member states. But it's also very important, WHO is related to the health sector. So all the medical societies, all those public health officials, all those involved in health of the population should be trained and should be prepared to learn about the health effect of air pollution, and also to act and to speak with patients and to speak with the society. So that's why WHO says health sector should have a leading role in the changes for air pollution.
Just one last thought before you go. Does the WHO actually differ in its data collection on the field we've been talking about here today? Does it differ from other global institutions, national institutions? Does that make it difficult to actually deliver a clear political message? Is it all comparable?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because I'm only consultant of WHO, so I should make any disclaimer that these are my words, not WHO words. Of course, it's difficult because it's international body, and there are political relationship and decision. But it's very clear, from the World Health Assembly in 2015, air pollution is considered among the most important risk factor worldwide. So this is something that WHO has taken on board, and now air pollution is one among the most important risk factors for NCD. So there's a clear declaration from WHO.
Perhaps one brief question before you leave us. Smoking has come up over and over again. We saw the big tobacco. Anyone remembers the film The Insider, until somebody came out and actually blew the whistle on the big tobacco, it was just, you know, your facts, my facts. From a WHO hat perspective, are we at a tipping point in public awareness? How many more people need to be dying every year to actually make it a tipping point issue? Or are you still pushing at a closed door in people's minds from a policy perspective?
Yeah, from a policy...
On air pollution.
Yeah, it seemed very clear. Well, Bert Brunekreef was presenting the words from Sir Bradford Hill. You know, there's always something more that is needed. Some more research is needed, but this does not prevent us today to act immediately. We know enough. There's no need to know more to act, and this precautionary principle should be applied immediately. There is no need to have more evidence regarding this.
Okay, Professor Forastiere, he has to leave for the airport, but thank you very much
for being part of
the...
I'm very sorry. Thank you.
We need no more evidence to act, Professor Rahmstorf. Well, then you'd be able to delete your presentation, because we need no more evidence to act. And yet, this presentation is one you've given before, and I'm sure you'll be giving it a lot again. Maybe back to my original question. Do we see this, the subtitle of this was Research, Evaluation, Societal Change. Research is there. The evaluation of that research as societal change. Where are you? What are you hammering away on at the moment with your work and your doctoral students?
Well, I think in the climate problem, it's clear that we basically know enough. We have the facts, and we're running out of time to act. This is a major crisis, and so I think the main impetus has to be on actually reducing emissions. And evaluation is important of climate policies, like what the German government is going to announce tomorrow. How much emissions reduction will that actually bring? Because politicians, they like symbolic policies that don't hurt anybody because it's so much easier, but then they also don't help very much. And I think you know much better than anyone else that getting out of fossil fuel use will have huge co-benefits in terms of reduced air pollution and human health.
Professor Tetley, I'll just come to you to even things out here. I don't know if you saw this week in the Guardian, there was a report it was from Nature Communications, and we're talking about the evidence is there, and it was confirming that unborn babies are directly exposed to ultrafine particles. They penetrate the placenta. This has now been confirmed with all the health consequences of this. If something like that, unborn babies are breathing in ultrafine particles, and before their life is even begun in the world, they are carrying around the effects of diesel. If that doesn't move public awareness ahead, you know, like big tobacco, what more do we actually need? You talked about the DNA evidence, you talked about the cellular damage. Why are we talking, and why is the world out there not quite listening to your research?
I don't know if this is working.
There we go.
Okay. Yes, I do know about that work, and there's been previous work. And in the slides that I didn't present, there was biochemical and molecular biological data that supported, that went in parallel with those data, indicating that there is mutagenicity, that there are things happening with the DNA, and that support the data. Because if the particles are there, it's not necessarily the particles that are doing the damage. It could be, I would say, more likely what the particles are taking with them to the fetus. Now, I don't know about what governments will do about that, but it would be the health professionals, I think, that should push that.
Do you think there's enough discussion between yourselves and the health professionals in a double-pronged action, as it were, and cornering politicians on this?
Well, I think that there is discussion about it, but whether the politicians are willing to believe it, it's the evidence, isn't it? It's the strength of the evidence. Is there enough evidence? I think there is, and I think they should listen, but you've got to get to the right people at the right time.
Professor Brunekreef, oh, excuse me.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
Just take the other microphone there.
Let me be blunt, but perhaps not controversial. If you look at every opinion poll in the United States, people support more environmental protection, but we're going the other way. If you look at cities across Europe that are passing diesel bans, right? That's in response to public pressure. The problem isn't communicating with the public. The problem is that the EU and national governments, including my own, respond to pressure from industry. And that is what's holding back doing things. It's not that the public doesn't think that air pollution is dead. It's not that the public doesn't think that climate change isn't dead. It's that the governments won't do things that are opposed by industry. And that's the problem that we need to solve. I mean, it would be nice to train more clinicians. It would be nice to get more public knowledge, but we need to generate enough public pressure that the governments have to do what they don't want to do.
But you are a key person who got them to do what they didn't want to do. You, like few other people, actually pushed it in the positive direction, improving our awareness, improving our quality, and improving pressure to bring about the Clean Air Act. And now we're seeing the pendulum swinging back the other way. What was working then that isn't working now? What can we in Europe learn from what the Trump administration is doing and what people like you are trying to push against? What has changed?
Well, one of the things that's changed is human beings don't have the ability to worry about more than a few things at a time. And in fact, the environmental movement, for very good reason, is focused on climate change. And in, the 80s and 90s, it was focused on air pollution. And so it's not that if you ask the people, they don't say, oh yeah, no, I care about air pollution also, but the political heat and pressure is more being felt on the climate change side. And yeah, principle, we could do both, but
limited capacity. There's
a limited capacity for environmental groups and others, to push on environmental issues, and it's now turning to climate and away from air pollution. And I think that's what's changed in the US that allows coal companies to buy the government and not generate the kind of massive demonstrations that happened in the 60s and 70s when they also bought the government, but they were forced to change.
Well, on a European perspective, Professor Brunekreef, do you share his pessimism that there's a limited capacity for people to be worried about too many things? Is air pollution suffering, awareness suffering because of the shift to, the Greta Thunberg revolution? Do you share his pessimism that Europe will be following along the US example in a few years' time?
I'm not a specialist in figuring out how many things people can worry about at the same time, so it's kind of hard to answer for me. Francesco, before he left, he said something important, I think, which is that we need to aim for not burning fossil fuel at all in the near future. And how near that future is something that we will have to figure out together to see what we can achieve in a reasonable time. I'd like to add to that maybe we should even stop burning stuff altogether, including renewables. Because we now have in Europe the situation, and that was referred to earlier this morning, that we get a bigger and bigger share of wood smoke, for example, to the air pollution mix. And No, I don't think that's a good development, because it does create a lot of air pollution. It does create a lot of air pollution health problems. So I think when we talk about stopping burning fossil fuel altogether, we should probably also include burning renewables.
But we can't just halt urban development or mobility for cleaner air. I mean, they are just there. There's a fact.
Electric cars work.
Indeed. Well,
no, this is a very long-term perspective. So, you know, you can't tell people to stop driving cars overnight. You can't tell people to stop heating their homes, for example, overnight. That's a very bad idea.
No, but can you find a way to make air quality to be prioritized so that life has to fit air quality needs rather than air quality needs fitting our privileges, our habits, our laziness?
Well, it's also very much an equity issue. You know, a big discussion in my own country at the moment is who is going to pay for the energy transition. And it's very easy to sort of convince the layperson that it's them who will pay more than others. And that's the best way to lose support for energy transition policy. So that's the big challenge, I think, for policy, is to figure out a way that, you know, you're not creating more inequality than we already have in our society in terms of who's going to pay the bill.
Professor Rahmstorf, we've been hearing that attention in your field goes up, attention in their field goes down, but you're saying, well, there's not a lot not enough is happening in my field either. Allies here, competitors for people's empathy and attention? I mean, is one a subset of the other? What do we do to bring these professionals and their research into your battle? Because it's all the one battle, isn't it?
Yes, as I mentioned, there are obviously, if we get out of burning fossil fuels or fuels altogether, that will be both benefiting climate and health and air pollution. So it's a win-win situation. And I think that climate has really captured a lot of attention. That's quite a recent phenomenon with Fridays for Future, because for 30 years I've been giving talks like this, and not many people were interested in listening, and emissions have gone up and up and up. So I think we also haven't been very successful in getting real policy action, and I completely agree with you that this is due to mainly resistance by industry. And maybe you mentioned, why is this more successful, this resistance now than in the 70s? I would posit the hypothesis that it has to do with our media world. And it's not in vain that in Australia, in Great Britain, in the United States, we have these populist politicians now in the government, and they're all kind of Rupert Murdoch media countries. And you know, how many people are watching Fox News? Could Trump be imagined without Fox News, for example? I think the media world, and especially media owned by a few very rich people, are a big part of the problem here.
Thank you. Just for the three non-German panelists here, the debate that you mentioned, Professor Tetley, you weren't quite aware of the scale of the debate, but from the Netherlands, I mean, the German debate here over diesel, over also in the society, but that let's open up research, let's question research, let's have a long discussion. Has this actually fed into the international debate? Or is Germany having a discussion amongst itself?
Well, to some extent, it's a phenomenon which has been restricted to Germany, I think, over the last year. We've had repeated conversations in my country to what extent we should have or we should fear a similar debate in the Netherlands, but it hasn't come up. So it hasn't been raised by politicians at all. It hasn't been raised by interest groups to the same level as what happened here in Germany. So I was a bit surprised when I saw these developments in Germany evolving over the last
Surprised,
year.
happy? Yes.
It could be, you know, part of the story is perhaps that we don't have an automobile industry to speak of, so that may make some difference, I guess. So to some extent it's a German issue, but the issue of, you know, raising doubts about science is much more universal. That happens in my country as well. And that's definitely an issue we need to come to grips with as scientists.
I see. Professor Schwartz said the German debate, was it just in your own Fachkreis, in your own specialist circles, or did the German debate here, obviously arising out of the diesel cheating, but going before that, was it an issue, or is it a German-only debate?
Well, I think as Bert said, the attack on science is worldwide at this point, because in the 70s, I think a lot of industries naively believed that when the science was done, people would show that this was all nonsense, right? They don't believe that anymore. And so the attack is now on science. The specific issue of NO2 from diesel engines, and of course the diesel cheating scandal
started in the US.
Right, and that's where they actually had to do something, as opposed to these make-believe little tweaks that Volkswagen did to their engines here. You know, we made them junk 500,000 cars.
Sitting in a desert. Yes.
They can't sell them outside the country, and they can't operate on the road, you know. So, but the NO2, I think, is a particular diesel issue. NO2 hasn't gotten a lot, German issue, hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the US. The focus has been more on particles and ozone. The fact that it's focused on NO2 is, I think, a local issue here, and I think it's because you have so many diesel cars. And you know, when diesel cars operate on city streets and stop at traffic lights and sit there and drive at, 30 kilometers an hour in stop and go traffic, the pollution control devices really aren't working. And so you can't possibly meet the NO2 standards with those diesel engines. And so there's an inherent issue here that we don't have, because we don't really have diesel cars.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm just aware of the time. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left to go, and I'm aware I've been doing a lot of talking today. I think it's time probably to open up the discussion to the floor. We've got a great panel here. Has anyone been sitting on a question they've been waiting to get rid of, or shall I ask a warm-up question to give you time to think? Please just name and title and your question and who it's directed at.
In terms of NO2, diesel plays obviously a negative role. But in terms of CO2, carbon dioxide, it was argued that diesel is of advantage. Is that correct?
This was the political will to make one go up and the other go down. That was the issue.
It is correct that it was argued. However, you have to remember several things that make that argument weaker. One is that we measure fuel volumetrically, and so while you travel more on a liter of diesel than on a liter of petrol, a liter of diesel contains more grams of hydrocarbon. And so some of the calculations ignored that. Not only that, but the hydrocarbons are richer in carbon compared to hydrogen relative to petrol. And so that also overstated the benefits of diesel in terms of CO2 emissions. And finally, the deposit of black carbon soot in the Arctic, it has changed the albedo of the Arctic and has reduced the amount of reflectance of incoming solar radiation, which warms the Earth, accelerates the melting of the Arctic. And when you put that all together, plus the increase in fuel economy that we now see from gasoline engines, direct injection gasoline engines essentially get per gram the same amount of fuel economy as diesel, I think that was a fallacious argument. And the notion that you should move from that argument to burning wood to heat homes and cities is as stupid.
Please.
While I have the microphone, there's one point that I would like to raise for the audience or for all of us. I heard in the first talk today of from the Federal Bureau asking for help from scientists and data. I've heard that 3 times, saying what we need is advice, we need data, and we need directions. Then we heard from Rahmstorf that we can say, listen, this is a high time of urgency. The last time I remember times of urgency changed research agendas, HIV/AIDS, for example. When that came as a tsunami, research agendas nationally and internationally changed. There was suddenly a huge amount of money going into that research. What I'm missing is at the times of urgency that the research agendas change towards research into basic science, fundamental understanding of what you need to be doing, because I would predict to you that a whole lot of research went into target finding for interventional therapies for cancer, infectious diseases, and you have it, but nothing, relatively speaking, went into this high urgency area of research that seems to be needed because we have 3, 13, 23 years. And I'm wondering what we're doing to actually inform this policy making to change research agendas, because that seems to be notoriously, including Germany, a weak spot. We spend much more money in things that seem to be less urgent, if I may say, and I'm just wondering what we can be doing to actually change this sort of tide. Money is needed to actually get that research going, and where is it?
Well, I'm not very knowledgeable about research policy, but the German Science Ministry certainly has been putting money into climate solutions, supporting research in various fronts of what can be done about climate change. But I couldn't actually tell you, compare the volume compared to what is spent on health problems or whatever. So I just know there is, to some extent, this has become a priority in German research, but I lack the knowledge to quantify it.
Professor Schwartz, do researchers need to tell government what to tell researchers to do and give them money to do it?
My government lacks the receptor gene for that information. I used to apply to NIH for grants on climate. I now apply for extreme weather events, which just sort of happen.
Bert?
If you think about the health sector and the kind of research that they support, there's a lot of work going on and planned for addressing non-communicable diseases for obvious reasons. There's been a lot of attention for air pollution. There's continued attention for air pollution, and that is partly because of the big numbers, I think, that are generated for the health impact assessment. It's clear for many people, I think, that air pollution is a major public health problem. For climate change, we sort of lack that kind of numbers, that kind of assessments. It's good to keep in mind that climate change actually was part of the first global burden of disease report that came out in the early 2000s, I think, and has been dropped from the global burden of disease efforts. And it's my understanding, I'm not closely involved with that, but it's my understanding that this was because the science was seen as too limited, too uncertain when it comes to the relationship between climate change and health. The Lancet has a commission on climate change and health that puts out a report every year, sort of the countdown series it's called, the countdown report, that is trying to follow the issues around climate change and health. WHO has the latest report on climate change and health, I think is from 2014, has made some assessments of what the burden of disease related to climate change worldwide might be in 2030 and 2050, so looking ahead but not too much ahead in time. But we sort of lack this let's say, the big numbers when it comes to climate change and health that have helped the air pollution world to put their problems on the agenda, which has helped the folks worrying about cholesterol, high blood pressure, etc., which are major factors in the global burden of disease, to get their item on the agenda. I think it would be reasonable to make a plea for WHO, which is closely linked to GBD and the GBD folks themselves, to reconsider climate change as a major issue to put on the agenda for the GBD and the burden of disease, realizing that, you know, the kind of data, the kind of evidence base that you need to do that properly is much more difficult to generate for climate change, given the fact that we're looking into the future, given the fact that these are, you know, geologically very fast, but on an epidemiological scale, very slow processes. And to, you know, to get that back on the GBD and GBD agenda would maybe be one thing that we could consider, which you could consider pushing, to make sure that public attention for climate change is increased again.
Speaking of public attention, I mean, as an Irishman, I know all attention in Britain, it's like a black hole being sucked into Brexit. Is there any capacity in Britain at the moment for what Professor Rava was talking about, researchers, an appeal coming from government to government agencies, we need you to put this on the agenda? Or are you looking to partners elsewhere in Europe to actually keep your work going, keep the funding going, keep the attention going?
Personally, I'm not looking towards partners in Europe. I think that everything's in abeyance. But I think there's a big effort at home amongst the air pollution scientists to keep everybody informed, including government agencies. We have items on the TV, on the radio, in the papers all the time. I do think that our government is very preoccupied at the moment. And I think the other thing is that they want some solutions. They want us to go to them and tell them what to do. And I think as soon as you can do that, they will start thinking about how to do it. And I think that means that we've got to work closer to people in other disciplines so that this becomes a much more multidisciplinary approach to solving the problem. We can't do it ourselves as the research groups we've got here. We've got to bring all the others on board. And certainly at Imperial, we're trying to do that, and at King's, they're trying to do that. So I think that's the way it's going. But it's slow, and it's going to be slow until Brexit is sorted out.
Indeed.
Some years.
If we have no more questions, I've got no more questions from the floor, otherwise I have one last thought I'll put to you all. And one of the reasons we're sitting here is because of people like me, journalists who came crashing into the German research world on air pollution a year, 18 months ago. And we did some good, we also did a lot of damage. Because here we have an international panel and one German guest here on the panel. In your field, dealing with journalists, dealing with the complexity that has to be reduced to their level, to the reader's level, how do you do that on a practical level without corrupting the long-term work you're actually doing, the serious work you're doing? How do you make it journalist-friendly in the hope that they will make it public-friendly, in the hope that that will make it lead to that tipping point that we hope we will reach with air pollution? How do you deal with journalists, with people like myself, and keeping it simple but keeping it honest as well?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that question, because I have a reputation of talking journalists out of a story, as they say. That's because, you know, with every new paper that comes out, there is a headline often stimulated by either the public relations department of the research institute or by the public relations department of the journal, that sort of exaggerates the findings into something unique, because, you know, man bites dog is a story and dog bites man is not a story. And when I'm confronted with those kind of things, you know, seemingly spectacular findings, I sort of try to take the approach, let's take a good look at the evidence in total. Let's not get too excited about every new study with some interesting new findings and try to generate a lot of hoopla about that. Having said that, I do think it's important to communicate to the public, but more on a let's say, continuous basis and less so on a basis of incidents and new papers coming out and news items that get to the press all the time. So I've been active in the European Respiratory Society Environment and Health Committee, for example, for a number of years. We have tried to put out position papers. You've seen an example today, actually, of one related to the German debate. And to comment on new proposals for policy from the European Union, to get involved with the European Union, to make sure that the scientists and the parliamentarians understand what the issues are and get into conversation with them so that we understand what their issues are, because it's not a unidirectional thing. But I think that's more important, to try to get a long-term message across and to keep repeating that. And maybe to finalize as one example, we've heard about this 25 microgram per meter cube annual standard for PM2.5 from the European Union. When that was promulgated in 2008, the policymakers said as soon as we reach 2005, we can stop. As soon as we reach 25, we can stop doing things. And we, as a scientific community, have been mentioning the simple message: 25 is not good enough. 25 is not safe, and we've had audio, visual material to explain that to a lay audience. 25 is not safe, 25 is not safe. And we've been repeating that since 2005, basically, when the proposal was first published by the European Union, forever. And I think that has caught on in Europe. And I don't know many policymakers anymore who believe that 25 is safe. The majority wants now to move towards the air quality guideline value of 10, with more or less enthusiasm, but they are moving in that direction. And I see a lot of activity, especially in cities. Cities are taking the lead, much more than national governments in Europe, to improve things, to create better transportation possibilities, to stimulate active transport, to try to remove the polluting cars from the city center, and to have a more comprehensive view of what a healthy city is like, what a climate neutral city is like. And it's the cities in Europe which are taking the lead at the moment, and where we should look, I think, for positive developments in the near future.
Okay.
A long answer, I'm sorry.
No worries. Professor Tetley, you said there's no shortage of stories in the British press. I'd agree with you there. Do you have any tips for your German colleagues on how do you place your messages so that you actually recognize them in the next day's newspaper?
Well, we work closely with our press officers in academia. I don't know about industry. Don't know how interested they are in telling anybody anything, but certainly in academia we work closely with press office, and we get approached all the time by the press, by TV programs and radio to talk about it. So they are already aware of it. I just don't know how that moves on to action.
But the press office has a gateway to filtering the serious from the non-serious.
It's the press office, definitely.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Professor Schwartz, I mean, you're a great communicator. Everyone loved your lecture, so what is the German colleagues, not that they need to be taught anything, but what's worked for you in the States?
Well, what worked for me that doesn't work as well anymore is to pick up on what Bert said about sort of long-term messaging. And that was a lot easier when I was doing lead in gasoline, because the New York Times and the Washington Post had environmental reporters who stayed in those jobs for decades. That was their beat, right? And I remember talking to the reporter from the Washington Post at least for 40 hours about various things about lead until he got it, you know, and he would call me up and say, you know, I'm going to write this, and I'd say, well, you know, oh, not quite, you know, And then he got, you know.
And you got the country.
And then they decided he was going to cover foreign affairs, you know, and when the environment reporter for the Times retired, they also decided they'd go to this rotating thing where someone would have the environmental beat for 3 years, and then they'd move on and someone new would come in. And that makes it a lot harder. You know, you get tired of spending 40 hours with one reporter year after year after year. You'd like it to stick for a while. So I don't know what the situation is.
I'll take that back to my editors and say,
you take it back to your editor.
Rotating,
and I don't know,
yeah.
you know, I don't know about the Frankfurter Allgemeine or whatever, but you know, it would be very useful if there were reporters who had the environmental beat for a long time so that they could learn and then they could report better.
Indeed.
And that would communicate better and help everybody.
Indeed. The last word to you, Professor Rahmstorf. You don't lack for climate coverage, and I'm sure your phone never stops ringing, but do you get the kind of coverage you want? And do you have any advice for, considering you've got a hot issue, does it actually improve things, or is it just creates more noise and you actually need more quality? What would you say to colleagues here who are struggling with the air pollution issue, getting it on the agenda, getting it the depth it requires and the consistency of coverage?
Well, I would second a lot of what has been said. To just say something different, one solution that I found for myself is blogging. So I've been doing that for, I think, about 15 years at least now. And in a blog, you can write it exactly as you like. There's no editor who fiddles with it, or a journalist to whom you talk, and then he makes his own story, which may be more or less inaccurate, depending on how good he is. And I was also constantly frustrated that you can't show a scientific diagram in a newspaper, and in a blog I can do that. I can actually take diagrams from the original peer-reviewed publication and discuss it in the blog. And so that has worked pretty well for me, because it has a multiplication effect, because science journalists, they then actually read my blog, and often they cite it, or they ring me up because of a blog article. And so that has worked pretty well for me.
Okay, so and the articles are also tagged thematically, so you can actually pull up a lot at once if you're a journalist in a hurry looking for something. So as a journalist who has been in a hurry, I would like to apologize on behalf of all my colleagues who've made your lives hell in the last 12 to 18 months, but I think I've certainly learned a lot today, and it would be nice if the world turned slightly less fast, that we could actually have these more in-depth conversations more often. But I'd like to thank Professor Rabe. I'd like to thank our panelists, Professor Rabe's team in the background who've done tremendous work, and our translators and all the technical staff. Thank you all for coming. I would have liked to have time for a few more questions, but I think we've started an interesting conversation on clearing the air in Berlin. Thank you.